Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and answering your questions tonight, the Shadow Minister for Communications, Malcolm Turnbull, author and social activist Eva Cox, the US Ambassador to Australia, Jeff Bleish, Egyptian novelist and commentator Adaf Souef, and the Foreign Minister, Bob Carr. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Well, Q&A is live from at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Saving Time. It's simulcast at News 24 and News Radio. You can go to our website to send a question or join the Twitter conversation using the hashtag that just appeared on your screen. Well, our first question tonight comes from Kate Bevitt.
It was recently revealed that Ben Ziggia, a dual Australian-Israeli citizen, committed suicide while being held in an Israeli prison in 2010. Details of his death were suppressed by a court-issued gag order and then later by pressure from Benjamin Netanyahu. Are you concerned by the Israeli government's lack of transparency?
Bob Carr.
I think the Australian people have got questions they'll want answered about this. I've asked the head of my department to give me a report. We'll focus on what points of contact there were between Mr Ziggia and his family on the one hand, and the Israeli government, and the Australian Embassy in Tel Aviv. There are a lot of questions. I'm as keen to have them answered as you are. I think, and I'm venturing into difficult territory, I'm just speculating at the present time, I think we've got to conclude that there is a special challenge in people who've got dual nationality who go to work for a foreign government. And I think we need to think about how we regard that, and this could be an issue we've got to tease out as we go through Peter Varghese report.
Yeah, you told Senate estimates that the Australian government was informed on February 2010 through intelligence channels that Ziggia had been detained in relation to, quote, serious offences under Israeli national security legislation. Do you have any idea at all what those offences were?
No, I don't, and we'll clarify that to the extent we can when I get that report from the head of my department. I think these are reasonable questions, but I need to get a history. So we will get
the community will get an answer to that question, will they? Are you convinced of that?
Well, we'll have a comprehensive report on it. I'm not going to say what's going to be in it, what's going to be out of it, but as much as anyone here, I'm keen to have some of the mysteries around this addressed. But as I said a moment ago, one of the things we've got to think about is the problem presented by someone who goes off, in this case to the Middle East, takes out dual nationality, and if the reports are to be believed, reports in the Israeli media as much as in the Australian media, worked for a security agency. Now that presents particular problems, and I'd like us to think about what they mean in terms of what level of consular protection might be demanded in a case where someone has brought himself into a danger zone by working for a foreign government and perhaps working in the area of intelligence and espionage.
Just one more quick question from me, because we haven't heard a lot from you on this. Is it possible that he was imprisoned because the Israelis believed that he was about to give information about what he was doing for them in the security?
Tony, I don't know. And
is it possible, though?
I don't know. I'm not going to speculate about it. And when we get that report, that might be one of the questions we're capable of answering.
And we've just had a tweet, evidently, from P. Katz. Has the Australian government asked for the tape covering the cell the Aussie was held in? Obviously,
we'll address that. We'll address that in the report. But we've asked the Israelis for a lot of information, and there's some information on this that only they can supply. Quite a lot of it. We're not capable of getting that ourselves.
Well, let's see from the rest of the panel. Adaf.
Well, I think obviously it's very sad what has happened. But I think that it's really excellent that it has come out into the open, and it wouldn't have come out into the open had it not been for ABC. And I think that it's good to look at what does not come out into the open, and the question was put as to the level of transparency of the Israeli government. Now, we have known, the world has known for a very long time, certainly since 2001, that there are facilities. There is notably Facility 1391, which is a completely secret jail. And while in the case that's being discussed today, this is somebody who could have been working in the Secret Service, the people who've been held in 1391 and the other 4,500 prisoners in Israeli jails have not been working for the Secret Service. And in fact, they are, Palestinians. And so I think that it's interesting what the media picks up on. And I, for one, and I know that many people would be very heartened if this was an occasion for the media to pick up on what is happening to Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And it's interesting that this is happening today, that we're having this panel discussion today, when a young man, Arafat Jaradat, was just killed, actually, in an Israeli jail 2 days ago. He was picked up on the 18th in his hometown just north of Hebron, and within a few days he was dead, ostensibly of a heart attack under interrogation. And many Palestinian prisoners have gone on strike, on hunger strike, in sympathy, and there have been stands all over the Arab world also in sympathy. And I think that this is an issue that is of tremendous interest.
Okay, Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I think it's a very unsatisfactory state of affairs at a whole range of levels. I mean, Bob was obviously very embarrassed initially because the Department of Foreign Affairs had told him that they'd never heard of this gentleman's situation, and then it became clear that our intelligence services hadn't kept the Department of Foreign Affairs briefed on it, so that looked ungainly. But there's a bigger issue, I think. You can imagine the Israelis saying, well, Mr. Zigir left Australia, he's a Jewish guy, comes to Israel, becomes an Israeli citizen, makes his home in Israel, joins the Mossad, the most important secret intelligence organisation in the State of Israel. And they would say, look, he's one of ours. He's one of ours now. He's made a choice. And so this puts countries, in Australia in particular, in a very difficult position. How do you extend consular protection to somebody, as Bob has said, is taking themselves out of their own country and not just taken out citizenship in another country, but have actually joined the Secret Intelligence Service? But this raises a very important issue that I think we're going to have to look at relating to passports. Mr. Zigir had taken out, so it was reported, Australian passports under different names. He'd changed his name, which is perfectly, people are entitled to change their name. But I understand, and Bob may be able to comment on this, that there is no question asked when somebody takes out an Australian passport whether they hold a passport for another state, whether they work for the government of another state. And I think we need to ask the question, should we be issuing Australian passports to people who are Australian citizens, multiple passports as it turns out, when they are working for a foreign government and indeed a foreign secret intelligence service? Okay,
before I bring in the other panellists, I'm going to bring in the next question, which is also on this topic, and because of the way you constructed your answer, Malcolm, I think it's worth bringing in Adam Kay.
Thanks, Tony. My question's for the panel. It's not unusual for intelligence agencies such as the CIA and MI6 to misuse foreign passports for their own security purposes. Israel is a state which is surrounded by enemies and faces a unique existential threat from its neighbours who do not believe in its right to exist. Why then is Israel held to a double standard when it comes to this issue?
Eva Cox.
Well, I don't think they are held to a double standard because I think that this particular issue hasn't arisen up in this particular way. There's another Australian connection I think we need to remember, which is the Mordecai Vanunu affair many years ago, where he lived in Australia and then was kidnapped by Mossad and disappeared into the system. He was not an Australian citizen. I think what this sets up...
And he wasn't kidnapped from Australia either.
No, he was overseas by that stage, which is another issue. But I mean, I think what it raises for me is the much bigger issue, and it goes to the point you're making, which is that Israel is losing a lot of its legitimacy by involving itself. I know it's under threat. I'm a Holocaust survivor in that sort of sense. I know all of those things, but I do think that if Israel intends to survive, its ability to be open and not to lock people up in jails, not to hide people, not to hide what they're doing, really raises serious questions about Israeli democracy and about the openness of the Israeli government. I mean, one of the things they keep running is saying, but we're the only democracy in the Middle East. But I mean, when they behave like this, put people in jail, you can't find out what they're in jail for, regardless of whether they're an Australian citizen or not. and there's no information sort of flowing onto the outside, it raises for me some very serious questions about the legitimacy of the claims to be a democracy that Israel puts up.
Jeff Bleish.
Well, I'm not familiar with the specifics of this case. It doesn't involve the United States. And with respect to the statement about how different intelligence services use or misuse passports, I'm not aware of there being some convention that passports are routinely misused. And
it's a convention. It's a convention in Hollywood, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Every time you see a spy, he gets a little suitcase and opens it up, and
they open it up,
and must come
all
from
different
somewhere.
currencies and special glasses. And,
They even won the Oscars on one of those films today.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the problems, is that there is a blurring of lines between what is entertainment, what is fantasy, and what is reality. And people just assume that they know conventions when they don't. It's just, I'm not aware of anything like that, and I think this is just one of those instances where maybe in
Would you
books
be
and
able
movies,
to tell us if you did know of anything like that?
I would be able to tell you what our protocols and procedures are. And as I'm saying, I'm not aware of any systematic misuse of this type of
So
material.
I've just got to follow up one thing, though, and it relates to the first question, really, or the first question from down there, in fact. What steps would the US take if one of its citizens, albeit a dual national, was locked away in a secret prison and no one was allowed to talk about it?
Again, these sort of hypotheticals.
That's really good to talk about hypotheticals, because they get to the heart of the matter.
There is a treaty called the Vienna Convention on Consular Rights, and any individual who's an American citizen who is in another country and is being held is entitled to consular services, and that is one of the great hallmarks of international relations. So that is the way we work and operate.
But did Mr. Zigier, the Foreign Minister will know this, I'm sure, did Mr. Zigier or his family request consular assistance?
The best advice I've got is they didn't, and that the family nonetheless had access to him on a large number of occasions. So that's a bit tentative until I get the definitive accounting of this, but it seems to be the case that they didn't seek consular assistance. On the question of passports, Australia cannot allow in any circumstances other countries to abuse our passports, to have people running around on espionage missions using Australian passports, for a very simple reason. It places the lives of all Australians who are travelling at risk. We can't do that. And that's why in 2010 we reacted very strongly when there was evidence of the, uncontested evidence, of the Israelis using Australian passports, people, agents with Australian passports, to give effect to an assassination. We had to object strenuously to that, and indeed take the position of expelling an Israeli diplomat. But that was all because of one consideration here, and that is Australian safety, the safety of Australian travellers.
Have you taken steps, therefore, to go to the other questioner's point? Have you taken steps to find out whether other intelligence agencies from different countries might also be using Australian passports?
Well, we'll leave that till we've got this report. I'm not going to canvass all these issues for very understandable reasons, I think, Tony.
But have you taken steps to find out?
In practice, with the long-standing behaviour of governments of both sides of Australian politics, I will not comment on matters of security and intelligence.
A brief comment from Adolf, and then we're going to move on to another subject.
Sure. If I could just very briefly pick up on one sentence in Alan Kay's question. That statement about Israel being under an existential threat, I really think that the time has come for people to interrogate this statement, and anybody, before actually sort of buying into it, should actually check the history and check the amount of peace deals and agreements that have been put on the table and that Israel has rejected, and should just sort of, again, count how many times Israel has attacked its neighbors or has been attacked by its neighbors, and also should look into the financial and business interests, the network, the web that is in the Middle East, and then should really make up their minds whether Israel is actually under an existential threat or whether peace and security are actually within its reach if it should want to reach out for it.
That is a massive debate that we won't have time for right at this moment. You're watching Q&A. Our next question is a video. It's from Mark Blackwell in Glebe, New South Wales.
Mr. Carr, Julian Assange is still holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. I've heard your Australian government's kowtowing head in the sand response ad nausea. Ironically, exactly what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks attempt to counteract. When are you going to show some intelligence and guts on this issue and ask our good friends the USA exactly what their real intentions are regarding one of Australia's more renowned journalists?
Okay. Julian Assange being in the Ecuadorian embassy in Knightsbridge has got nothing to do with the United States, and nothing to do with WikiLeaks, and nothing to do with state secrets. I've just been to Laos and I've seen the impact, 3 million unexploded items of ordnance, of a secret war. So someone who spills secrets has got my inherent sympathy and support. But Assange is another case, and his position here has nothing to do with that part of his journalism. He's there because the Swedes took a case in the courts of the United Kingdom about allegations of criminal behaviour, and they won in the courts of the United Kingdom. Julian Assange could have been the subject of extradition action by the United States any time in the last 2 years when he's been residing in the UK. He wasn't. To suggest that the Swedes are after him as a CIA conspiracy to get him to Stockholm and allowing him to be bundled off to Langley, Virginia, is sheer fantasy. The Swedes have won in the UK courts. It's nothing to do with WikiLeaks. It's about a criminal allegation made in Sweden. And that's why he's in the Ecuadorian embassy. In this, Australia has precisely no status. We've got no standing in the courts on this in the United Kingdom. We've made representations to the Swedes about him being treated with due process. We've done that 3 times this month. We've made every...
By the way, just on that score, have you got some sort of assurance from the Swedes he would never be extradited to the United States?
The Swedes say it is our policy and has been our policy for decades that we never extradite someone on a matter related to military or intelligence. They just don't do it. That's why there are draft resistors who are still living in Sweden decades after evacuating the United States during the Vietnam War. Now this again is a matter between Sweden and its prosecutor, who's won in the courts of the United Kingdom, and Mr. Assange. Now if the Swedes had him in Stockholm, he'd be even more harder for the US to extradite, if that's what they want to do, than he's been for the last 2 years in the United Kingdom.
Okay, before I bring in the rest of the panel, and we will, I just want to go to another question on this topic. It's from Matt Watt.
People all over the world know that the US government are trying to get their hands on Julian Assange. Some US politicians and commentators have called for his assassination, yet Senator Carr and Ambassador Bleich are suffering from WikiLeaks grand jury denial. Is it because they're both named in the WikiLeaks releases?
Jeff Blanche.
Well,
perhaps you could take the section about the WikiLeaks grand jury denial, because I think that goes to the heart of the matter.
No, I mean, I think the heart of the matter is there is this sense that the United States is pursuing Julian Assange. As the foreign minister said, Julian Assange was in London living freely for 2 years. If the United States had wanted to extradite him from England, they could have done so. We have a more robust extradition treaty with the UK than we have with Sweden. There's no reason to try and come up with some convoluted false charge by 2 women who claim that he slept with them and forced himself on them without a condom as a way to get him to be stuck in Sweden so he can be extradited. It's just it is a ludicrous proposition. It's not, and so we have nothing to do with it. The United States has not sought his extradition from the UK, and to the extent that we are focused on any sort of crime, we're focused on the crime of people stealing classified information from the United States. There's currently a proceeding against a guy named Bradley Manning for stealing classified information and then giving it to WikiLeaks. That's what our focus is on.
Our questioner's got his hand up.
I've got 2 documents here. These are subpoenas for 2 US citizens. One is David House, another one's unnamed. for a grand jury, it's got the grand jury number on it as well. Will you now admit the grand jury exists?
Again, this is one of those sort of gotcha things that people love to do about Julian Assange. They love to say, well, we know the United States never acknowledges whether or not there are grand juries. And the proceedings of grand juries are always confidential for the security of the people who serve on grand juries and also for the confidentiality of their deliberations. That's how we've handled every single grand jury throughout the entire history of the United States. And so when we get questions like, will you admit that there is or is not a grand jury? Or will you admit that there is or is not one of the subjects being pursued? Of course we have to say, well, of course we can't talk about it. And then the answer is, well, then you obviously don't deny it, so it must be true. Yeah, that's just, it is one of those games that people play in order to create some sense of drama. This is a very simple matter. There's an individual who's been charged with a crime in Sweden. The UK courts were prepared to extradite him. He didn't want to face extradition, so he sought asylum somewhere else. The United States has nothing to do with it. We're not connected with it in any way. UK, Sweden, Ecuador, it's not our deal. And to try and say, well, there must be something going on that's secret is just that. It's back to the first question. It's, movies and fantasies and spy novels.
Eva Cox.
I think the problem with this one is nobody is saying that they set up the women in Sweden. Nobody is saying the things there, but it's an inquiry which could have been solved by sending Swedish prosecutors to Britain, could have sorted it out, has become a major issue. Look, I was in the States a couple of years ago, and I can remember having dinner with some people, Democrat voting senior military people in South Carolina, and this woman came out with a statement. She said, look, as far as we're concerned, somebody should assassinate Julian Assange. Because of what he's done is put American lives at risk. There certainly has been some fairly vocal things from the USA saying, this person is a traitor. What you're doing with Bradley Manning is, similarly seen as protecting your rights in the same way as we're talking about the Israelis protecting their secrets and the various other things. There's a very nasty feeling of sort of paranoia on all sorts of sides, but the Americans don't give a clear assurance about the whole thing there. The Swedes are pursuing it in a way which I think is completely over the top. Julian Assange is probably somewhat paranoid about the whole thing, but he does have some reasons for being paranoid, given lots of statements saying that he'd be better off dead. And I just think, that everybody is sort of trying to say, oh, not us, everything is doing that there. Yes, it would be good if Assange went and faced the things there, but he's very uncomfortable about it. Why didn't they send anybody to London? It just strikes me that the whole thing has ended up being a sort of total farrago of fear and misunderstandings and denials to a point where it's become somewhat grotesque.
So for the record, I've told the British and I've told the Swedes that if they want a diplomatic solution to this, we would be happy to help in London. But in the meantime, it's got the status of a legal dispute in which we have no standing. The Australians have got no standing. The Swedes have won in the English courts, and it's a matter between them, the Swedes and the English, and the Ecuadorians.
But it's not the English courts. I mean, you're making it sound as though he's been found guilty in some way by the English courts.
No, I'm not.
No, but what they have done is, all the English courts have done is implemented a European extradition treaty, which has got nothing to do with the quality of the evidence.
But it was a victory. It was a victory for the Swedish prosecutor, and
yes,
it did take place in the English courts.
But can we just get to the point that the second questioner asked there, Matt Watt? He's basically saying, and although the ambassador can't admit it, that there is a grand jury going on in the United States.
Can't admit or deny.
But you can't.
This is the point.
Who are those people?
This is the point. And let me, the point is this is all about misdirection. This is all about, let's not talk about the real issue on the table. The real issue on the table is that there is an organization called WikiLeaks, and their goal is to say anyone who steals information from governments will post it up indiscriminately on a website, and anyone can read it.
Do you regard them, and Julian Assange in particular, as a journalist? Because if you did, journalists do that sort of thing all the time.
No. So here.
And if you did regard them... If you did regard him as a journalist, he would have protection under the Freedom of Information Act.
Let me say two things. First, you don't really mean that about a journalist. If you really think...
First Amendment,
do you think that journalists say,
we have
look,
freedom of information.
any information that's
First Amendment.
any information that's taken, I don't care what it is. Post office worker he's a government employee. He says, you know, all this mail that's coming through, I think everyone should read it. I don't think it should just go to the recipient. All these IRS tax forms, I think everyone should know everyone else's financial information.
Sure.
You know, every medical record, every public hospital, I think every single person should get to see everyone's medical records. And, you know, everyone who's proliferating nuclear weapons, I want the people who are... who are trying to capture them. I want their efforts to be exposed so the proliferators can get away with it. And I want that guy in Syria who's trying to keep leaders from killing his own people, I want his identity to be revealed so that he can be killed by Bashar Assad. That's what I want in the world. And you as a journalist, you receive that information and you say, you know, I'm a journalist, so I'm going to put it all on a website, and I'm going to invoke my First Amendment rights.
So I've got a big question for you.
Yeah.
Why isn't the editor of the New York Times in jail? Because they're the ones who published it.
Yeah. No, you see, here's
the New York
the
Times,
issue.
the Guardian in Britain, the biggest German newspaper.
No one has
Most of the newspapers in Australia publish this information.
No one has prosecuted any journalist, including anyone from WikiLeaks, for this in the United States. Now, I don't know whether it's legal or illegal, because that's not my job. What I can tell you is it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. It is fundamentally unsafe, and it hurts the security of every single person who is dependent upon the government to serve their needs, to protect their interests. And that's the reason I reacted so strongly when you said, well, it's a journalist. No self-respecting journalist would ever say, that's my job. My job is to just take whatever stuff people throw at me and I'll throw it up on the web. And then the point of being a journalist, the point of being responsible is to say, I'm going to take information which is relevant to inform the community about things that really matter to it and to ensure that members of government who are entrusted with particular responsibilities abide by those responsibilities.
Okay.
That's what journalists do. I'm lecturing journalists on journalism. But that is, but honestly,
you are, yes.
That is...
And it's quite a long lecture. Shall we hear from some of the other panellists? Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, look, I think this the Assange case got off to a very bad start as far as the Australian government was concerned when Julia Gillard, right at the start, said that he was a criminal and that he'd broken the law, and said the federal police were going to investigate him, and it was perfectly obvious that he had broken no Australian law. And indeed, ever since the High Court's decision in the Spycatcher case, if he had sought to publish the WikiLeaks documents in Australia, the Australian government, or sorry, the United States government, nor the Australian government, could have obtained an injunction to stop them being published. So he hadn't committed any wrongs under Australian law. He may have done something morally wrong, Jeff, and I'm not suggesting that he didn't. But so the Australian government portrayed itself through its Prime Minister at the outset of not only not being sympathetic to this Australian who was in very hot water, say he put himself into it, but absolutely hostile. And at the same time, there were senior American politicians calling for him to be hunted down like a terrorist, which, is, I would think, even for somebody of a nervous disposition like Assange, would create a fair degree of anxiety. Now, as far as the question about Sweden versus the UK is concerned, I took up Assange's case in the sense of making representations to Kevin Rudd when he was the Foreign Minister, because some of Assange's supporters were constituents of mine and had asked me to do that, and I'd spoken about it, and I asked Kevin Rudd to have a close look at it. And the advice that he gave back to me, which I might say was consistent with my own conclusions, was that he was under no more likelihood of being, was no more susceptible of being extradited from Sweden than he was from the UK. And his lawyers were arguing that he was very vulnerable in Sweden, but not so vulnerable in the UK. And that actually is not the case. And I don't buy that, and I can't find anyone who's expert in the area that does. So I think there's a great old saying that anyone can go to jail if they get the right lawyer, and it's also true that anyone who's represents himself has a fool for a counsel. But I'd say this: that Julian Assange, I think, would have been much better advised if he had actually gone to Sweden and got this thing dealt with. I think he has been, and I say this, you know, without wanting to judge the morality of his conduct, but just looking at it, you know, professionally, as though I was back in my old job as a lawyer, I don't think he served his own interests at all well, and I think he would have been better off going to Sweden, dealing with what doesn't look like, I might be wrong, the biggest, you know, prosecution in the world, dealing with that rather than finding himself in the Ecuadorian embassy. And I'll just make one other point. You know, I'm not convinced that he's broken any American law either, you know, quite frankly, unless there is evidence that he somehow or other conspired with Bradley Manning or paid him or induced him in some sort of dishonest way. I think the US government has enormous First Amendment problems in prosecuting him, enormous First Amendment problems, and of course that would only make him a martyr. And if there's anybody who is, I can't think of anyone in the world today who is keener to climb up on the cross and be martyred than Julian Assange. And I don't see why the US government would want to give him a leg up.
Let's, a final and quick response from the ambassador.
No, I mean, you know, quick response is that's why you have processes. The reason that there's a process for declassifying information is because, you know, you want to have you don't want to have any individual member of the government deciding what secrets are revealed and which ones aren't. And the same thing with, you know, that's why you don't have panelists, you know, sort of deciding what American law is. We have a whole process, and people will figure out whether or not a law was committed or not committed. And,
do you think that process is underway as we speak?
You know,
trying to find out if he's guilty of a crime.
You know, all I know is that there has been an investigation of Bradley Manning, and wherever that takes, the prosecutors and Department of Justice, they look to see whether a crime was committed, and then, you know, if there's evidence to support a prosecution. They don't start out saying, okay, we have to prosecute these people, now let's figure out a way to do it. That isn't our process, and so it's just going through a normal process.
Which Assange may well be part of.
You can't confirm or deny.
Okay, all right, okay, it's time to move along. Our next question tonight comes from Mary Nicola.
My question is to the US ambassador. Hopefully you can answer it, but to me and 15 million Coptic Orthodox people in Egypt. With high unemployment and a crippled economy, why has the Obama administration chosen as a priority to fund through American tax dollars the delivery of US-made weapons, F-16s, tanks and aircrafts to the radical Muslim Brotherhood government of Egypt, especially when President Morsi has been cited saying, boycott all products made by American enemies, and then Jews are descendants of pigs and apes?
Before I bring the ambassador in, I'd like to hear... We do have an Egyptian here, so I would like to start and hear from Adaf on this question.
But the question was about why the American government chose to send F-16s to President Mubarak, President Morsi. That's a Freudian slip.
Well, I mean, I suppose the core of the question is whether or not that's a good idea. As an Egyptian, what do you think?
I think it's a terrible idea, an absolutely awful idea. And I beyond that, 2 days ago, the news broke that the Morsi administration has ordered a further 140,000 gas canisters, again from their friends in the United States. That's tear gas canisters, which are due to be delivered in April for when we go into elections. This is a useful election tool. And in fact, they've even, it becomes more interesting, they have issues with the logistics of their being delivered. And so the Ministry of the Interior in Egypt has asked the military in Egypt to bring them over on military planes. And the company that is importing them, which is G4S Security, interestingly enough, will pay for the transport. So many questions here. why is the government-to-government deal being mediated through a private company? Why is the military going to carry these tons of tear gas to Egypt? Why is the government importing all this tear gas just in time for the elections? And why is it spending $2.5 million on new tear gas at a point when it's telling us that we are so hard up that people should take down their intake of bread from 5 to 3 units of bread per day? So clearly, it's a terrible idea.
Jeff Bleish.
You know, Egypt is going through a very difficult period right now, coming out of the Mubarak regime and the revolution, and now trying to restore its its economy. And they have not been operating as a democracy. Their economy was in terrible shape before this, and then with the Arab Spring, there was a real fall off in the economy, tourism, everything else fell off. And so they're in a worse position than they were in before. The U.S. has been trying to allow the people of Egypt to determine their own leadership. At the same time, we've been trying to make sure that the economy stays stable enough that it doesn't descend into chaos. We're providing humanitarian assistance into Egypt. And we have always, and I can't speak to the specifics of either your question or the allegations that Araf has raised, but what I can say is that they are also vulnerable to people coming in from outside groups, really dangerous extremist groups, terrorist groups, and they have to be in a position where they can defend themselves. You can't completely defang their military. You can't completely defang their military.
It's not, well, I mean, but what you're really doing is basically honouring a commitment to the previous dictator to sell 16, or give them, in fact, 16 F-16s, 200 Abrams tanks. I mean, that's quite a substantial military assistance.
Well, you know, we are assisting them not in taking action against their own people. We're trying to protect them against outside invading forces, which could. And every country needs to have the ability to protect themselves.
Yeah, can we just shift this here? I've raised with Hillary Clinton and with others in Washington the issue of protecting minorities, the Western world taking an interest in protecting the minorities of the Middle East. The question comes from a woman who identified herself as someone with a Coptic background. Perhaps 10% of the population of Egypt is Coptic, and they feel very, very nervous at the present time. In September in Egypt, I was able to ask President Morsi whether, on behalf of all the Copts I know in Australia, this splendid community, whether he could give me guarantees I could take back that he would protect them. And he said, I don't want to be head of a theocratic state or a military state. I want to be head of a civil state. I want to be president for all the Egyptians. And I think the Western world's got a stake in seeing that minorities that have lived in the Middle East for 2,000 years, the Christians, but others as well, the Kurds, for example, let alone the small Jewish populations that have survived in Arab countries, should, during this tumultuous period of Sunni revolution, be protected. We've got an interest in protecting the minorities of the Middle East so that we can preserve something of that wonderful overlap of cultures, that cultural diversity that was for a long time the heritage of Middle Eastern life.
Bob, our questioner has a hand up. I'll just go back to you. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, just back to the US ambassador and to Bob Carr. The only enemy Egypt is fighting at this point is the people itself. US-made bullets are in the bodies of the Egyptian people themselves, whether they are Muslim or Coptic Orthodox, because they're all against the tyranny of the current President Mohamed Morsi. So if you think that we're going to be invaded by Iran or any other of our Arab neighbours, you're sorely mistaken, because you'll find plenty of bodies with US-made weapons at this point. And to Bob Carr, I highly encourage you to continue that pressure on President Mohamed Morsi, because at this point the next elections for the parliament is during our Holy Week of Lent, and no Coptic will be able to actually go to those elections.
Yeah, can I just assure you that the first phone call I made to an Australian ambassador after I was designated, not even sworn in as Foreign Minister of Australia, was to Ralph King, our ambassador in Cairo, to ask him to visit the Coptic churches and the monasteries and to call on the acting Pope to give me a report on the safety of this great community. I'll be at the Coptic Church in Sydney on Sunday. Their welfare is very close to my heart, and Australia will fight hard to see that their anxieties aren't increased as this Sunni revolution plays itself out.
Okay, just going to go to a tweet that's just come in. It's from Jacob Waba. Egypt has had one revolution. There's another one coming. What do you say to that, Adif?
I think it's very likely. I just want to say to Neri that, in fact, they have, after Twitter and the media sort of wiped the floor with President Morsi, they've changed the election date to avoid Palm Sunday. But the blindness which was there to make them put the election date there in the first place was remarkable. I think that we need to be very careful when we look to Western powers and say, could you protect minorities? Because this is traditionally how colonialism and imperialism have come into our countries. And I think, thank you. And I think that this divisiveness, where they come in to protect the Christians or they come in to protect women, I think this divisiveness is, we are beyond that now, and that is very, very clear. And I think that one of the amazing things about the revolution, and that we've seen since the revolution, has been the extent to which society, and particularly within the revolution, has moved to assert Egyptian unity and the absence of that kind of division. I mean, people actually, like Muslims going to church to pray with the Christians, like Mass and prayers being celebrated together in Tahrir and so on. This is all really important. Foreign intervention can only damage that, and it is totally not a good thing. And you're completely right that American bullets and American arms are being used to kill Egyptians indiscriminately.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring the ambassador back for a quick comment on that, and I want to hear from our other panellists as well, quickly.
No, again, we're using every one of the tools that we have available to us to assist the Egyptian people to choose their own leaders and to get those leaders to respect human rights. That's what all of our efforts are geared towards. And there are diplomatic efforts behind the scenes, there are humanitarian efforts, there's the use of economic incentives and humanitarian incentives.
Yeah, Tony, I think this is a point worth making. When I talk about protecting minorities in the Middle East, I don't mean any crude intervention, but I do mean when we sit down to talk to the head of an Arab country, when we get past talking about selling them patrol boats or working towards a Middle East peace process or whatever, there is always an agenda item which is about this, which is about human rights. A gentle, persuasive representation that they should protect their minorities because those minorities are part of the patchwork of the Australian community, and it is an Australian interest. It's an Australian interest to see that they're protected in these countries. Not just the Copts in Egypt, but Kurds throughout the Middle East.
I mean, I'd like to hear from our other panellists, so I won't sort of let this go for too long, but I mean, do you worry about the fact that our key ally is providing fighter jets, tanks,
that's a matter of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Egypt.
Okay. Yes, Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I agree with Bob's enlightened remarks, and I think the single most important thing that we should be demanding and indeed providing encouragement for is the rule of law. Unless you have the rule of law, which means that the majority can't wipe out the minority, then democracy just becomes majoritarian tyranny. The challenge that the Copts have in Egypt is frightening. That is an existential threat, absolutely, as indeed is the position potentially faced by the Alawi in Syria, and indeed the Christians in Syria as well. Not to speak of the Shia. I mean, the if democracy means a Sunni majority can wipe out the minorities, then that is not what we can accept as a democracy. But we need very, very cool heads, and we need to be calm about it. I mean, Bob has been very calm tonight, although last October, Bob, on the ABC, you called for Bashar al-Assad to be assassinated.
No, that's not right. I mean, that's plain silly. That's not right.
Well, you did on Four Corners.
I remember precisely what I said, and the tape will confirm it. I was asked to speculate how the regime might end. The week after the Minister for Defence had been assassinated. And I pointed out that it could come with the shearing off of part of the Alawite support base, and that could be accompanied by an assassination. Malcolm, that is very, very different from calling for an assassination.
Well, Bob, but seriously,
different.
But Bob, seriously, all of us were anxious about if you did have a hit list, who would be on it? Whether, given the...
Malcolm, you would not be on it because you're my favourite Liberal leader.
Yeah, but what... I would think, having regard to the turmoil in the Labor Party, one could be concerned about some other domestic targets.
OK.
I've got no idea what you're talking about.
Can I just
Yeah, go ahead, quickly. Yes, you can.
Just very briefly, I mean, it was one of the comments that the ambassador made, and your intervention in that is that the arms provisions of the American things, the whole arms industry in America and its tie-in within the points that were being made about the sort of the sales and things like that, it doesn't help democracy to provide the sorts of weapons that can be used against civilians. It doesn't, as people say, it's not a threat. So maybe the American arms industry ought to be sort of pulled back when these things are happening, so at least they don't have the sort of weaponry that can be used against civilian populations. And I think the Americans are far too ready to sell their arms to anybody who'll buy them, regardless of their politics.
All right. You want to respond to that?
No, every single foreign military sale goes through an elaborate process to make sure that those sorts of things are assessed.
Well, you do a very bad process in that case, judging by some of the results of some of your arms sales.
And look, it's to be assessed in advance so that you make sure that if people are purchasing these, it's for their legitimate self-defense. Every country has to be able to defend itself. Australia has F-16s, they have F-18s, they have a whole variety of things. It's not because they want to turn it on their civilian population.
No, well, we're not talking about that. No, that's a totally absurd argument. I think the Americans have got a very long record of providing armaments, of bringing things in, of using things like drones, of doing various things. I mean, have a look at some of the things you're doing around Pakistan and Afghanistan. You are not sort of pure people who sit there thinking for every gun, I wonder who's they're going to shoot it. So don't come that one on me, please.
Well, you know when you're on Q&A. Let's change tack. Our next question comes from Malcolm Barnes.
Okay. Mr. Carr, sporting history shows us that many champions choose not to retire at the right time, instead playing one more game, innings or series, often to the detriment of their own team. Is this sporting analogy relevant to Julia Gillard and the Australian Labor Party today?
You lose me with sporting analogies.
We could actually make it Shakespearean and refer to the season. There aren't many Shakespearean plays that didn't end up with someone being lying dead on the floor, particularly if it involved politics.
All the comedies and romances are free of that.
The core of that question...
OK, we've got another question.
The core of that question really is whether Gillard will survive.
Well, if the question's got to be translated for me, I think there are some difficulties with it. Let's take another one.
Well, I'd like to hear the other panellists on the question we just said. Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I agree with John Howard that politics is determined by the iron laws of arithmetic. But the iron laws of arithmetic do seem to have been suspended by the Labor Party. They sacked Kevin Rudd when they were ahead in the polls. And now that it's screamingly obvious that Rudd, they will do better with Rudd, they seem to be determined to keep him out. It's quite interesting from a sort of pathological point of view. The hatred for Rudd among some quarters in the Labor Party is greater than the natural human instinct for survival, and that's very rare. I mean, it's a sort of it's very rarely seen. You'd need an anthropologist, I think, to find a precedent for it. But it's worthy of study. I think it's one of those. It is one of those cases where this has moved. The Labor Party, the modern Labor Party, has moved from politics into sort of paranoid, pathological anthropology, that sort of study. It's an intriguing stage.
The psychopathology of the shadow cabinet, Malcolm, would bear a lot of analysis too.
Can I ask Malcolm why he's not the head of the Liberal Party, because he's actually more popular than the current Liberal member? Because if you could explain that one, it's a very similar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's
the same phenomenon.
No, I think it is very, very different. I think it's very different because it's different. It's different because, again, the iron laws of arithmetic. We are well ahead in the polls.
Yes, but your leader hasn't been very popular till now, and they haven't shifted to you.
He's more popular than Julia Gillard, and that is the only thing that matters.
It really did beg the obvious question.
But you see, let me give Bob a sporting example.
You've made this point, and I really think I should pick you up on it. I mean, if really all that's keeping Tony Abbott in power is the polls, if they turned against him, would everything change?
Well, no, they wouldn't. They wouldn't, not between now and the election.
Just wondering about the iron laws that you're referring to.
Well, the Labor Party is so massively behind in the polls. The decision to sack Rudd was extraordinarily unpopular. It offended Australians because they'd elected him. I mean, you've got to remember, Rudd was elected in a presidential election. I was out there campaigning in that election, and everywhere I went, you could barely find a corflute of the local candidate. It was all Kevin. It was like a personality cult. So the Australian people felt they voted for Rudd, and then without any warning, he was sacked by his own party. Now, you see, you talk about me being sacked as leader of the Liberal Party. The Australian people didn't elect me leader of the Liberal Party, but they elected Kevin Rudd Prime Minister.
But they want you to be leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, they may. Well, God bless them all if they do. But the issue is Rudd, and it is genuinely fascinating. I mean, Bob's a great student of Labor history. Bob, have you ever known there to be this sort of extent of self-loathing in the Labor Party before?
Malcolm, I'd put it this way. My party is battered and bruised at the moment. It's down on the polls. But it is still the instrument for bringing out the best in Australia and the best in Australians. And it is still the way, Labor policies and Labor governments are the way you marry economic growth and environmental protection. It's the way you achieve, on the one hand, social justice and sound budgets.
What about single parents?
We're the people in there battling for that. And matters of principle, Malcolm, do not worry your side of politics.
No, well, you guys. But hang on. I want to give Wayne Swan credit, because he battled away on the mining tax, and he held his hand. He wasn't prepared to be a total bully, and so he allowed the three biggest miners in the country to write the tax, and then managed to profess some surprise when it didn't raise any money. So that was there was a proletarian hero if there ever was, you know. And the working men and women of Australia should be pleased.
You'd abolish it. You'd do away with it.
We could certainly afford to abolish it.
Will you explain where your revenues are coming from?
Because oddly enough, excuse me, we actually have a question from the floor.
It's the easiest tax to abolish.
Our next question is from Liz Allen. It's related to this.
Malcolm Turnbull, if you were to become leader of the opposition again, and hopefully Prime Minister, have you learnt through previous experience that arrogance is a trait that needs to be overcome before you can effectively lead the party?
Well, I'm not. I don't have any expectation, or there's no chance of me leading the party before the election, or probably ever. But certainly between now and the election, our leader will be Tony Abbott, and he'll go on to the election, and in my view, he's very likely to win. But if you ask me about self-improvement, let me say this to you: when you have these big collisions and cataclysms in your life, and all of us do from time to time, they either break you or they make you a wiser, stronger person. You either end up, and there's a lot of people who have been destroyed by political setbacks, and I could have been. It was very, very gut-wrenching. It was devastating. It's a devastating business. It's terribly cruel business, politics, because all of your mistakes and blunders are out there in the public arena. You know, you've got nowhere to hide, there's not an ounce of privacy. But I got through that miraculously, large part, through the love of my family, my wife, Lucy in particular, my kids, and I am a stronger and wiser person as a result. Now, I would rather have not gone through that to become stronger and wiser. I would rather still be a little weaker and less wise and not have to go through it all. But believe me, it is a furnace. Politics is a furnace, and it either breaks you or it makes you.
May I respond to that?
Please.
I don't think it would matter if you were the leader of Labor, Greens, Liberals, whoever. Every Australian I speak to wants you to be leading the country.
Well,
and it's just something that your party won't acknowledge.
Well, that's very kind. Well, I'm very touched, and thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So I was just waiting to see if you'd say any more. The sort of pause that one leaves in live television.
It's not often I'm left speechless.
I'm surprised. Jeff Bleisch, I mean, are you finding...
I'm keeping my most neutral expression.
Yeah, but I guess one thing you would understand, watching the President go through 2 election campaigns, is the brutality of politics. This is the very thing that Malcolm Turnbull is talking about there, which I think we can all talk about without fear of losing your job.
Yeah. No, I think Malcolm's exactly right. We have turned politics, and perhaps it's always been this way, but it's more so in this media digital age. We've turned it into a blood sport, and we take people who generally they just want to do the right thing. You don't go into public life thinking that you're going to make a lot of money, and in most cases your ability to influence events is limited. You're part of big collegial bodies, and you're one vote among many. You're just trying to nudge the dial in a positive direction. And we are very, very tough on people who are trying to be public servants. And it's not a request for sympathy, but it's a request for perspective. How many of us are willing to sort of take the slings and arrows that both Malcolm and Bob and other people who seek elective office are willing to take on? It is damaging, painful work. So I take my hat off to politicians who are willing to do that, and I wish that we could be a little bit more generous of spirit towards people who serve the public.
Bob Carr, common ground there, I dare say.
No words of mine could add to that.
How noble. Are you finding Australian politics more interesting than you expected?
Well, it's great being in the heart of it like this, really. Politics and the media. I mean, what more could I want? Ringside seat.
Absolutely, yes. It has been a bit like that tonight. Eva Cox.
Well, as I say, it's lots of various things. I mean, I yelled out at one particular point when Bob was saying how beautiful the Labor Party was and its morality. They've busily screwed sole parents over the last few weeks, dropping their wages. I mean, dropping their pay rates and things. If the Labor Party wants to look as though they really care about poor people, they cannot go around cutting back on those sorts of things. So, I mean, it's a difficult time because we have both parties trying to prove that they're hairy-chested and they're awful, to the people like that, and only going for the same grounds. And, I mean, one of the things I've been saying for some time is, can we please start talking about the good society and not just the growing economy? Because then maybe we'll get to the point that you're making of starting to talk about the society we want to live in, not just talking about economic growth, because economics is a very failed discipline and it really doesn't deal with the things that really count.
Okay. I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. We'll have to leave it there on that remark. And please thank our panel, Malcolm Turnbull, Eva Cox, Jeff Bleisch, Ardaf Suif and Bob Carr. Thank you. And please join us next week on Q&A when our panel will include the Minister for Workplace Relations, Bill Shorten, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Julie Bishop, and the Greens Leader, Christine Milne. Until next week's Q&A, good night.